Thanks for tuning in today. I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist. Join me as I seek out the small incremental changes being applied in other industries that we can learn from and that can be applied in healthcare. Can these changes bring immediate value, but also add up to the big improvements and revolution we need in healthcare? Come along with me to explore the possibilities. My innovative guests from around the globe have used small incremental improvements to achieve their moonshot. And today, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Lawrence Kosinski. He's a gastroenterologist. He's also the founder and chief medical officer of SonarMD. Dr. Kosinski, thanks for joining me today.
It's my pleasure, and I hope the listeners enjoy our webinar.
So tell us a little bit about your journey to this point. You're a gastroenterologist, SonarMD. We're going to get into the details, but like to understand how you arrived at this development of a solution. What was the pathway? What led you to this point?
Well, I've been a gastroenterologist in private practice for over 30 years, and during that period of time, assumed multiple leadership positions. And back around 2011, I was asked to chair the practice management committee for the American Gastroenterological Association. And it was a 3-year stint, and I was determined during that 3-year stint to make this a worthwhile initiative. Gastroenterologists derive 85% of their income from one procedure, colonoscopy. We don't have a very diversified revenue stream. So my goal here was to try to help my colleagues diversify their revenue stream by encouraging them to get back into disease management and care management and maybe even make a difference in value-based care. So the main illness we take care of in gastroenterology is inflammatory bowel disease, a very significant set of conditions that involve young people, but are associated with devastating side effects, a lot of excess cost. So I had no idea how much it cost to take care of an inflammatory bowel disease patient, whether they had Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. So I went to Blue Cross Blue Shield, Illinois, our major payer, and all I wanted was data. Well, it took a few meetings of begging, and they finally realized this guy's crazy. He just wants data. He doesn't want a new contract. And so they gave me an enormous data set on 21,000 patients over a 2-year period. They gave me every claim they had. Wow. And it took us a while to analyze this. It crashed Excel. It crashed Access. We had to make a SQL database out of it. But after several weeks of analysis, some things came out that were surprising. The cost was not surprising, about $40,000 per capita, a very expensive illness. We're talking about Crohn's disease here. But what was interesting, there was a 17% hospitalization rate. And the doctor in me said, well, what happened before those hospital admissions? Could they have been avoided? And in over 2/3 of the patients, there was not a claim in the 30 days prior to the hospital admission. So that was our first aha moment that led to the development of SonarMD, because these patients were going over the cliff. They were deteriorating without realizing that it had gotten significant. And I don't think this is anything special to Crohn's disease. I think this applies to just about any symptomatic chronic disease. But if you have something that we term a high beta illness, high cost, high variability in cost, a propensity for serious complications, and you're symptomatic, it's not too much of a distance between your symptomatic state and a complication that is serious. So we felt we needed to develop a system, a sonar system, a way of pinging these patients in between their face-to-face visits so we could bring them down a little bit in their symptom intensity. And, you know, just about every chronic illness has a symptom index. So we borrowed some questions from the Crohn's Disease Activity Index and set up a set of questions that the patients could answer on their own. And back in 2012, we deployed a very crude version of what ultimately became SonarMD, but it involved using our patient portal and sending out some questions, and then we had our nurses hand calculate the scores, the Sonar score, which is basically a composite score of each of the questions, and they're validated questions, and they bring back a validated score, and then our nurses would monitor that score, and if the score went too high, they would reach out to the patients. And lo and behold, in a pilot program, we almost eliminated hospital admissions, and I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. So I went back to Blue Cross. We're now up to 2014 in this. We went back to Blue Cross and we presented our data, and they said, wow, that's cool. Let's make you our first intensive medical home we've ever created in a specialty group. So they attributed patients to us, and the agreement was we had to touch every patient once a month. Well, we could do that with the program we had set up. In return, Blue Cross agreed to pay us a small management fee, but they agreed to give us quarterly claims data on all of our patients. So we had a laboratory that we could develop. So once we deployed this, it was obvious I needed a better way of sending these questions out. So I engaged a local company in Chicago to build for me in a web-based platform what I had created in the portal. And once that was created, the patients would get a text. They would click on a link in the text, which would take them to their specific questions, depending on what illness they had. And our nursing team would then monitor this on a dashboard. And if the patient's scores exceeded benchmarks that we determined, then they reached out with a question, with a phone call. And lo and behold, we lowered the total cost of care by about 15%, which was driven through over a 50% decline in inpatient hospital costs and a 70% plus decline in emergency room use.
Right. So before you keep going, one of the things that jumps out at me, I mean, I love this concept. I think, the patients love it, keeps them out of hospital, reduction in costs. But, you started this journey looking at how to diversify revenue streams. And I'm sat here thinking, well, this is great for the insurer, the payers, the patients, but the one person in this equation that I feel is going to lose out is the physician, because you're no longer delivering the services. And how is that compensation? Are they making up the compensation?
Oh, this diversifies their revenue stream. It provides a new revenue stream that they didn't have previously, a management fee for managing the patient, in addition to their fee for service, plus a share of the savings. So the Sonar model is one where the specialty practice receives a monthly or quarterly supplemental care management payment, and they can expect to receive a percentage of shared savings. This is in addition to their fee for service. What we see is a decrease in inpatient care,
right,
which the physicians aren't compensated for very well. Also, a decrease in emergency room visits, which always occur at inopportune times. How many times over the course of my 30 plus years of practice did I have to leave my house in the middle of the night to go to the emergency room to see somebody? In return, there's an increase in office visits. Isn't that interesting? An increase in office visits and an increase in procedures performed, but the overall cost is less. So the payer's happy, the patient's happy because they're not having these complications. The physician is happy because they're actually supplementing their income and getting paid for thinking rather than for doing. I suppose the only entity that isn't happy are the hospitals, because they get less admissions, and maybe the surgeons are a little unhappy because they're not operating on as many people. But it's a win-win-win.
No, I agree with you, but one of the key elements in there, and I think you said Blue Cross Blue Shield were the folks that you were working with, is you can't do this in isolation. I think you have to do this in conjunction with the paying entities, since without their involvement and participation, this could end up being ultimately a loss, because you're essentially saying that this is the problem with a lot of sort of innovation in healthcare. We save money, but it ends up hurting the people that are delivering the care. And you rightly say, you know, physicians want to deliver the thought process, the medical thinking, the contribution, but need to be compensated for that. And the systems don't typically. So you managed to negotiate that with them?
Yeah, I did. I don't know how I did it, but we did it so successfully that Blue Cross is our biggest investor in SonarMD. And so now we've expanded outside of our home state of Illinois and have expanded around the country to other Blue Cross plans. In addition, in the 2016 MACRA rule opened an opportunity for something called the physician-focused payment model. Well, Sonar is the first approved physician-focused payment model under MACRA. And we now have a BPCI advanced IBD initiative, largely because of the work done by us at Sonar and done by the AGA in conjunction with us. So everybody has to be rowing in the same direction for these value-based programs to work. And there is so much inertia that we fight. Change is difficult. And change for the payer is a challenge. And so when we crafted our business model provides risk avoidance for the payer. It provides supplemental revenue to the medical practices so that they can promote the practice transformation that's necessary in order for us to participate in value-based care. And everybody is rowing in the same direction. We have the same goal: keep the patient healthy, keep the patient away from the complications. Everybody benefits in that process. So, I think I've been lucky to have communicated with the right people at the right time that had vision to allow this to go forward.
So as I pick up a few things in here, I want to sort of try and pull the thread that to me is a sort of central element to your success. And it might have sounded small. I don't think it was small, to be clear, in terms of the effort required. But one of the key facets that I pull out of that, not only getting on board, so having everybody at the table, all the vested interests, so that, you know, you could, as you put it, all in the same direction, but it was the asset that you derived from the claims data. It was based on data that I think allowed you to persuade them to at least try this and then prove it out. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Totally agree. You know, there are so many conditions that are currently under the radar screen of the payer. And this brings up our issue of what we call high beta illnesses. Payers are associated with, are focused on the conditions that have the largest number of patients who have them and the largest total cost of care. So diabetes is probably the classical condition that the payers are focused on. Diabetes is a low beta condition. It doesn't have a high variability in the cost per patient when you consider all of the patients who have it. There are high beta periods, but overall, it's a low beta illness. Now, I use this term high beta, which we stole from the financial industry. Investors know that certain investment portfolios are high beta because they vary more than the index. So if you have a high beta portfolio, your portfolio will vary more than the S&P 500, as opposed to a low beta one, which may vary less. At my age, I like a low beta portfolio, but if I was 30 years old, I might like a high. Well, I came to the conclusion a couple of years ago that illnesses share the same characteristics, that a GI index would exist for all GI illnesses, and certain illnesses in the GI space would vary more than that index, where others would vary less. And we now have data that we have been able to calculate along with Blue Cross that confirms our suspicion that in the GI space, Crohn's and ulcerative colitis are the two highest beta conditions, which means that's where you want to focus your management efforts. You don't want to focus your efforts on a low beta illness. Those should be bundled and commoditized and allow process measures to just make everything work better. Whereas these high beta illnesses, and outside of GI, if you look in the pulmonary space, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease is definitely a high beta illness. Sleep apnea is high beta in the pulmonary space. I suspect that in the cardiology space, congestive heart failure would be that way as well. And in the musculoskeletal space, I'm sure that the inflammatory conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, and lupus would also fit into this category. So we are focusing today on symptomatic high beta illnesses. And we believe that in those conditions, if you can pull the patient away from the third rail of complications by controlling their symptoms tighter, everybody wins. And if you can marry that to a value-based care structure, we have the foundation for forward movement in value-based care.
For those of you just joining, I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist, and today I'm talking to Dr. Lawrence Kosinski. He's a gastroenterologist and founder and chief medical officer of SonarMD. We were just talking about high beta conditions and the derivation of that from the financial market. And in fact, you know, that's the high variability. And I think from the younger generation, those funds that you would be attracted to because there's a bigger return, which is essentially what you're talking about in this healthcare context, that, you know, go for the places. And I think the corresponding low or negative of that is if you get it wrong, there could be a bigger loss. But that's one of the risks that you have to take on this, is approach it with that open mind to say, does this work? And if not, be willing to sort of drop it and focus on other things.
You know, you touch on a very important point here, and you touched on it earlier. The data has to drive us. And now we have 5 years of claims data, and we have a knowledge base that helps us be able to take risk in this space. And, you know, I think risk management going forward is the key to generating these additional revenue streams from value-based care. But the old days of the 1990s, where provider groups were just willing to take full risk, the results of that were horrible. And many companies like MedPartners and Vicor, you know, went under in the process. So we have to be selective about where we accept risk. We have to have a knowledge base that's data-driven that will help us manage that risk. And we have to partner with our payers. The payers are masters at risk management, and they need to construct these value-based programs so that they're designed so that we don't fail. And
right.
They actually shouldn't allow the providers to take unreasonable risk, because then everybody loses in that regard. But as you stated earlier, the data should be driving this process, and everybody has to be rowing in the same direction. The incentives have to be created and maintained so that the ultimate goal is kept in mind.
So we've sort of worked through the whole discovery phase, I think the testing phase, and you came up with this simple scoring mechanism. I imagine a single number, almost like a red light, amber, green light kind of approach. Make it simpler, but make it as simple as possible, but no simpler, to quote somebody very famous. Those of you that want to in the comments, please tell me who that was. And now you've proven this out. So, I mean, you've got all of these data points in IBD. I think you're going out further than that. Is that true? What's the sort of approach now?
No, it is true. We, our investors, who include two venture capital firms. One is the Blue Cross Venture Fund, which is, funded by, I think, 33 of the 34 Blue Cross plans. And then Arboretum Ventures is an equal investor. Our investors were willing to invest in us because we all see a much bigger disclosure to this process outside of GI. We just happen to begin in the GI space because of my practice and my knowledge, but we definitely feel that there's growth outside of GI. Plus, most of these conditions are now being treated with very high cost biologic medications.
Right.
So the pharma optimization piece also represents an opportunity for us. And there we can have a separate session on the use of biologics, but these drugs become an annuity for each of these pharmaceutical companies. You get a 20-year-old Crohn's patient placed on a biologic that's a $40,000 a year drug. That's an annuity. That right. Patient's probably not coming off that medication. And so we need to apply scientific methods to making sure that these are prescribed appropriately in the right location with the right focus on drug levels and treating to target. And again, there's data in science that we feel can augment the savings that we've already seen by controlling medical costs.
So what's the critical element for this as you sort of look at other diseases? You talked about some of them, obviously, in the respiratory function, cardiac diseases, sleep, which, is this continuous emerging challenging area. Is the key aspect to this for building this data? So the claims data seem to be a sort of nexus for this. Is that the way
the claims data is key. Now, but I chaired the Crohn's and ulcerative colitis care pathway task forces at the AGA early in the development of this. And in both of those pathways, we began our process with a risk assessment. I think in all of these conditions, a risk assessment begins our process. Then, following that, we can determine which patients need more intensive care coordination and which ones don't. And in the process, we have to create a continuous learning environment where we deploy these platforms. We follow what happens with the costs and the claims and what happens with the care, and that allows us to refine our risk assessments and refine our benchmarks for the scores. So I see this as a continuous learning process, and the conditions where this is applicable have to be symptomatic. They're high cost, high variability in cost, but one of the other keys to this is that the complications are so expensive, and they are what's driving the high variability in cost. So, we take care of a condition, irritable bowel syndrome. That's symptomatic, but it's not high cost per capita. It might have some variability. That's a low beta illness. Whereas inflammatory bowel disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, sleep apnea, congestive heart failure, these are associated with expensive complications, hospitalizations, and the use of expensive biologic medications is often also associated with them. So we feel that's where this kind of a platform has its main applicability.
So as is often the case, we're just about out of time. I think it's exciting to hear this opportunity for really gathering the data, doing a risk assessment, which I'm willing to bet, certainly when I went to medical school, I'm sure when you went to medical school, that wasn't part of the curriculum, but needs to be, right? You've learned that, and I know you added to your sort of education, all centered around this analogy, which, when I first heard it, all I could think of was the hunt for Red October with the give him a single.
Absolutely. No, that is exactly where it came from for me, because I had noticed this issue with the patients not going over the cliff, not responding, and I said, I need to ping them. I was watching the hunt for Red October.
Just to be clear, listeners, we didn't pre-coordinate that. That was just my guess. So
wow,
I
exactly what happened. I love the movie.
Me too. So, fantastic discussion. I think exciting opportunities ahead for SonarMD. Tremendous sort of analysis, use of other industries and thinking process. Just remains for me to thank you for joining me. Thanks for coming on the show.
It was my pleasure. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining me today. Do you have any better ideas, or have you found a small incremental change that's brought about a big improvement in your world? Let's continue the conversation on our hashtag, The Incrementalist, or share with me at DrNick1 on Twitter. You can find more information about the show on our program page at healthcarenowradio.com, and tune in next time to hear my discussions with leaders and innovators from around the globe who've revolutionized their space by using small incremental improvements to achieve their moonshot. I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist, and I'm starting a revolution through evolution.